Power and Agency in Political Public Relations. How Masculinist Politics Framed Competing Carbon Campaigns in Australia. Politics in Australia is inherently masculinist. Masculinity underpins the structure and language of political public relations and political communication campaigning. Masculinist political discourse is framed by masculinist structure, agency and power. Campaign strategies designed to communicate policy that cannot be supported in masculinist terms or attempts to frame policy in non-masculinist terms misapprehend the inherency of masculinity. The government communication campaign that framed carbon legislation in Australia failed to apprehend the inherency of masculinity and in so doing failed in its attempt to inform and educate its publics of the values in clean energy. Masculinist political discourse in the government advocacy campaign presented an opportunity for space to open up for the opponents of the legislation to frame their own campaign on familiar ground, the masculinist image of conservative politics. To underestimate the significance of the structure, power and agency of masculinity in politics is fraught. The federal government allowed masculinist discourse to hollow out its Clean Energy Future campaign and associated carbon legislation. The legislation was passed in November 2011 and enacted on July 2012. Unlike previous contested legislation such as the Goods and Services Tax, the carbon tax remained alive in the media and in the public sphere. The public relations campaign to sell the idea of clean energy to the Australian public, an ideological pursuit was to alter the nature of Australia's socio-economic relationship with its global trading partners and shape the future of Australian society, was poorly conceptualised and thus compromised in its operationalisation. The adoption of a masculinist discourse by the clean energy advocates failed to differentiate the campaign and to represent clean energy as a true alternative discourse to extant masculinist discourses. The Clean Energy Futures strategy was the subject of advocacy and opposition campaigns, a situation that appeared on the surface to have been inflamed by the media. In fact, from the outset, the advocacy campaign undertaken by the government bore the hallmarks of failure. The clean energy issue and its subsequent advocacy campaign was poorly devised, poorly executed, and lacking in theoretical and methodological clarity. Political public relations are framed by the construction of a political discourse. Analysis of the political discourse of the Clean Energy campaign begins from the premise that political discourse is inherently and normatively masculinist. There is no single or simple origin that we can identify as the starting point for masculinity, and it cannot be isolated as beginning in a single place or at a single point. There's no single form of masculinity, and that no specific institution therefore can be isolated as the source. The oppositional carbon tax campaign was therefore able to draw on a number of discursive identities and images that allowed it the flexibility to construct multiple discourses to attack the government campaign from a number of strategic angles. The government advocacy campaign, meanwhile, remained caught up in a discourse that was unable to counter the flexibility that accrued naturally to the oppositional campaign through its multiple discourses. In this, gender is performative, especially so in the political sense, and constitutes the identity it is purported to be. The performance model provides insight into gendered speech in which masculine and feminine styles are consciously conveyed by actors who seek to constitute themselves in a particular way. The way in which an actor orients their discursive selves is the way in which they are represented. Thus, Julia Gillard, as leader of the advocacy campaign, appeared to be attempting to engage with wider Australianness, while Tony Abbott, leading the oppositional campaign, presented a narrow engagement with masculinity. Instability and variability of gender identities plays out in most spoken and written political discourse. As an example, the microblog Twitter was a discursive political space that played out within both campaigns. Gender is not easily identifiable on Twitter, even when a real name is attached to an account. Discourse analysis provides a model for reflecting upon the masculinity or otherwise of the 140 character tweets that appeared under the carbon tax tag during and following both campaigns. Political campaigns are framed by issues, but they are played out by actors and events. Each meaningful interaction has at least two distinct elements: goal orientation and structural orientation. The carbon legislation as a political phenomenon was framed from two competing perspectives. For the campaigns to exist, a variety of actors were required to bring various roles to life. The actors, if they were to compete successfully in the campaign, needed to consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, create performance spaces for themselves and be recognised by their constituent stakeholders. Some of the leading actors used Twitter as a performance space, as others have done since and previously with other campaigns. Both campaign leaders adopted Twitter performances. To argue masculinity's existence in the political discourse of the carbon legislation is to argue recognition of the existence of masculinity. There can be no descriptive without a standpoint, and thus masculinity does not exist except in contrast to femininity. Gender reflects the material interests of those exercising power. Masculinity cannot exist in isolation from femininity and is an expression of the current image that men have of themselves in relation to women. Masculinity cannot be framed from a starting point that performs a contrast with femininity, but as a frame of asymmetric dominance and prestige devolving to men. Most individuals do not think or do not actively think about their gender performances, and it's unlikely that most individuals would frame their gender behaviour as a performance. For men, the object would be to behave in a masculine way rather than to play masculinity. Individual actors in the campaign made a conscious effort to demonstrate either masculinity as power or femininity as power through the combination of appearance and language. Appearance was a conscious metaphor for the Prime Minister Julia Gillard and the opposition leader Tony Abbott. Both leaders performed within a public space that I would term operational masculinity, a reified platform in Western liberal democratic terms at least, which allows it to function as a particular identity. Masculine identity underpins policies and actions across a number of social and industrial sectors. The Australian political system is dominated by the performance of masculine identities, or old-style muscularity, and this was invoked as a powerful strategy that framed both the clean energy campaign and the carbon tax campaign. Both strategies were overtly operationalised by the government and the opposition with the intentions of achieving advocacy and opponent goals. The operationalisation of the clean energy campaign and the carbon tax campaign as masculine identities posed questions about cultural complexity within political public relations in a highly gendered political system, not least of which are the images of the political sphere as emerging feminist and the myth that political public relations are gender neutral. The most useful methodology for the clean energy and carbon tax campaign is Potter and Weatherall's discourse analysis. This model provides a causal link to the campaign actions. Throughout the campaigns, language use was traded as a warrant for action. In one form or another, the language of the campaign most often represented a call to action rather than an invitation to stop and consider the results of the action. The communicative action basis of the language of media statements, speeches, debates and other campaign matter, including brochures, flyers, leaflets and electronic advertising, was interpreted by the mass media and assisted in the formulation of popular opinion. The communicative matter was a call to action rather than a call to consider, and in this it presented an ideal space for the creation of polar divisions on instruments such as the microblog Twitter. Twitter provided the instrument with which citizens engaged purposively and discursively in both the clean energy and carbon tax campaigns, providing clear and unambiguous divisions between advocacy and opposition. The polar positions have their basis in the identities the individuals chose to establish their claims on the campaigns. Discourse analysis is concerned with the detail of passages of discourse, however fragmented and contradictory, and with what is actually said or written, rather than a generalised notion of what might be intended. Discourse analysis searches for a pattern in any matter under investigation. It's the role of the observer to look for patterns that might include both consistency and variation. Was there consistency, for example, in the various media statements made by the Prime Minister during the period of the Clean Energy campaign? Discourse analysis provides a broad theoretical framework for the observation of the functional and constructive dimensions of the campaign, those elements which formed the basis of the campaign in a traditional political campaign sense. An analysis of political discourse requires the presence of promotion of representations, which in turn are comprised of a variety of communicative devices that must be evident, authoritative and truthful. In other words, legitimate. For the purposes of the political discourse analysis of the clean energy and carbon tax campaigns, the elements that formed the basis of the analysis were evidence, authority and truth. The masculinity of the clean energy and carbon tax campaigns relied on precedent. Most forms of contemporary masculinity rely on earlier models, images of masculinity that resonate with cultural events, art and the idea that masculinity is grounded in some form of widespread acceptance. Masculinity can best be understood by imagining it as an ideology rather than having been created in a less abstract form. Masculinity as ideology is well situated within the discourse analysis methodology. As masculinity is most often imagined in relation to power, its ideological position helps to explain the construction of masculinities that serve particular instrumental purposes. The soldier image for Defence Force personnel maintenance, the corporate image for the maintenance of profit, the sporting image for the maintenance of corporate image itself. If we consider it an ideology, then we may buy into it without contemplating the nature of what it is we are in fact buying into. The Gillard government bought into the ideology of masculinity as an underpinning of the clean energy campaign, and once in, there was no place else to go. The forms of masculinity taken is the clue to the argument that masculinity underpinned the campaigns. It is not at issue whether the campaigns were successful or otherwise as political events. At issue is the masculinist identity of the campaign themselves, of the campaigns themselves. Discourse itself constructs mythologies of masculinity. Mining, agriculture and manufacturing are mythologized as masculine industries in which men occupy themselves. The argument against carbon and global warming is derived directly by the global warming opponents from these three industrial sectors. It was always going to be an impossible task for the government to divorce its clean energy campaign from the masculine discourses of mining, agriculture and manufacturing if it was to demonise them. The clean energy and carbon tax campaigns raised a number of questions about Australian socio-politics that can be answered by analysing the discourse on the Twitter microblog site. Both the clean energy campaign and the carbon tax campaign were political phenomena that required different levels of analysis. Both campaigns played out as sites which were, despite the presence of a number of women holding high political office, dominated by masculinist discourse. The adoption of a masculinist discourse by the clean energy advocates failed to differentiate the campaign and to represent clean energy as a true alternative to extant industrial discourse. Twitter, as a site that allowed political expression by both sides, also acted as a mirror image for reinforcement of the masculinist identities of the campaigns themselves. Thus, Twitter became an instrument of expression of identity in which all argument was counteracted and nullified. Neither side could claim to have used Twitter to successfully outflank the other. The advocacy discourse within the carbon tax hashtag was reduced to name-calling and threats precisely because it was unable to extract itself from the masculinist frame and because Twitter does not provide for a zero-sum effect. To apprehend the masculinist nature of the clean energy and carbon tax campaigns, we need to grasp the concept of power in politics. There are many definitions, and Friedrich says Power is not primarily a thing, a possession, but rather a relation. It manifests itself in the behaviour of following. Thus we have the present social media side of power, namely Twitter, on which there are those who are followed and those who follow. A government that is perceived to be legitimate will be more effective than one which is not. Rational, critical conversations in the public sphere, no matter how much that space has been reduced by public relations strategies, contribute to legitimacy. The Gillard government, during the Clean Energy campaign, entertained the notion that the broad Australian community would engage in a conversation that would make transparent every element of the proposed legislation. Legitimacy is enhanced by consent and consensus, and that consent makes the government's capacity to rule that much easier and more effective. The oppositional campaign on carbon tax eroded the government's already weak legitimacy to a dangerous level.